To celebrate Pride, I wanted to go through something that I think a lot of us aren't aware of. Whether we've just come out, whether we've been out for a while, queer history is something that doesn't really get the attention it deserves. Often even by people who are queer, whether you're gay or lesbian, trans, non-binary, or none of those things at all, and just don't know that queer people have always been around, they've always existed, and they've always been in nearly every aspect of society. And I wanted to start with the Old West. Giddy up, yeehaw. Because the Old West is a incredibly important time, not just in American history, but in our national perception. The idea of the rugged American individualist comes from the Old West. And it's something that has been essentially claimed, for better or worse, has essentially been claimed as a symbol of straight white masculinity. The reality, however, might surprise you to know, could not be further from the truth. Not only were there a huge amount of people of color who made up cowboys throughout the 1800s and 1900s, but homosexuality and gender nonconformity was rampant through the West, from small towns to big cities. There are many explanations as to why Americans began to migrate west. There were the political motivations of America's manifest destiny to colonize westward and civilize the indigenous population. Another motivation was economics, declining opportunities on the eastern seaboard and economic recessions due migration west with the promise of opportunity, particularly in the 1848 gold rushes and with the rise of ranching. Manifest destiny. Black and queer Americans also headed west, but for many additional reasons. For African Americans, the West presented an opportunity for freedom. Many initially headed west as fugitives, escaping southern plantations, and later as exodusters in the 1870s, fleeing Jim Crow. Queer people, as well as women, also headed west due to the horrors at home. Some fled sexual or domestic abuse, and others fled the growing rigidity of concepts of gender and sexuality. These groups were sold the promise of freedom in the West's colonization. Far from visions of white heroic masculinity, the West was filled with examples of representation. African Americans came to dominate the cowboy profession, with around 25% of cowboys being black in this period. This, plus the number of Latino and indigenous cowboys, demonstrates the West's diversity. This led some contemporaries to believe in a black spiritual affinity with the job. Some even became performers headlining shows and rodeos. Additionally, the West's lack of central authority was utilized by many to escape increasingly gendered codes of life. Ambitious women demonstrated this, free from conceptions of domesticity, exploited opportunities for businesses, like Mary Ehrlich Long, who ran the first woman-owned zoo. Others used the opportunity to create communities free from contemporary heterosexual and gendered expectations, with male miners in Camp Angel in Southern California holding dances dressed as women, wearing patches on their pants to signify their feminine role. As the LGBTQ community actively works for the rights and acceptance in today's society, it's easy to forget that homosexuality is not a contemporary development, but rather has been present among humans since the dawn of time. An examination of frontier life indeed shows that love between same-sex partners not only existed, but was acceptable just as today. Now, before I go forward, I do want to say that is not true in every context, and I think she does talk about it in certain areas. It was accepted in a way that wasn't really talked about. And we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get into bachelor marriages in a moment here. But widely, it was not accepted in the way that I think that sentence might lead one to think. There were not, pride parades. If you were gay, you kept it on the DL. Because in many places, due to overly Christian laws and the political structures of America, it was still illegal to be a homosexual. But that doesn't mean there weren't people who were homosexual. The Wild West was certainly untamed and uncultivated. Frontier life was one of isolation in wide open spaces where the constraints of civilization were not felt on one's day-to-day life. In this environment, unconventional characters, lifestyles, and differing types of behavior became more common and acceptable. The strong belief to live independently and unencumbered by societal norms could be applied as much to sexual freedom as anything else. While little was written about it in the late 19th century, and with Hollywood movies only presenting a more sanitized version of the Old West, it's not surprising that this aspect of frontier life is not commonly known. Historian Peter Bogue and we'll hear about a little bit more from him. He wrote a book that was incredibly illuminating for the subject. Historian Peter Bogue from the University of Colorado points out, quote, society didn't really designate people as homosexual or heterosexual through most of the 19th century. It was not really until the 20th century that those identities crystallized. Speaking from his 2003 book, Same-Sex Affairs, he explained to True West magazine, quote, in all men's societies, it was not unusual for same-sex relationships, and it was just as acceptable thing to do. People engaged in same-sex activities weren't seen as homosexuals. An environment where women were not often present, men sometimes displayed more erotic connections between themselves. A well-known example of this comes from a mining camp in South California that regularly held dances in which men danced with each other. We just heard about that. With some of the men wearing patches over their pants crotch to indicate their role as the feminine partner. As human sexuality was studied scientifically for the first time in the mid-20th century, it was revealed by Alfred Kinsey in his 1948 study, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, that homosexual behavior was more common in rural, more remote communities, most likely because the isolation of such places foster a make-do attitude among pioneers and outdoor men. Now, this is from the website Notes from the Frontier. The fierce Western ethos to live free and unfettered applied as much to gender and sexual freedom as it did to other areas of life. Frontier life was one of isolation, wide open spaces, and lawlessness, and divergent behaviors were common, so it's not surprising that, even though Victorians didn't write about it, homosexuality was as common then as it is today. But because the Victorians avoided the topic, then Hollywood followed suit with its sanitized black and white depictions of the West. The icons of the rugged cowboy and Western life were sacrosanct and simplified, but modern research, archival photographs, memoirs, diaries, and more open attitudes have uncovered a shocking underworld of the West. What was perhaps most shocking about homosexuality in the Old West was not that it was so common, but that it wasn't a big deal. In fact, miners and cowboys settled into convenient partnerships called bachelor marriages. When the miners in Angel Camp in Northern California had dances, half the men wore bandanas around their arms to signal their feminine role. Also, patches around the crotch. We already heard about this. It was also very common and accepted for same-sex bedmates to sleep together in small beds. While homosexuality among whites arose from quiet acquiescence and sometimes necessity, Native American cultures enthusiastically embraced alternative genders. They called them Birdash or Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit, so here's something that you will hear on occasion from people trying to discredit the idea of Two-Spirit identities, is, oh, Two-Spirit was created in 1990, which is true. It was created by an indigenous Native woman as a umbrella term, as a term to encompass other tribes and their conceptions of gender and identities. So the next time you hear somebody, because transphobes love to do it, they like to Matt Walsh does it all the time, where because he's just like terminally racist against indigenous Americans, where they will try and discredit that as if that is a newfangled idea. It's not. It is just a modern way to encompass an entire approach to life that was held by many different tribes across many different areas. So, Out Traveler, the trans history of the Wild West you never knew. If you're like most people, the image that comes to mind is most likely cowboys, bandits, lassos, and straight people doing very straight things. But certainly the idea of people of color dressing in clothing for the opposite gender doesn't pop into the imagination of most individuals. However, many would be surprised to hear they'd be wrong to count transness out of what has made up America's new frontier. In fact, it was quite common. In his book, Redressing America's Frontier Past, historian Peter Bogue argues just this. The book happened by accident. When asked how his work came to be, Bogue responded that he had discovered there were men wearing women's attire while searching for a completely different project. In the end, Bogue wrote a book researching the lives of those living in this frontier, discovering hundreds of individuals living their lives as the opposite gender, coming to form a part of day-to-day life in the Old West. When asked whether he was surprised by this discovery, Bogue replied he was, despite being a historian on this period of American history, perhaps due to the way queer history has been covered up. As the article, The Forgotten Gender Nonconformists of the Old West, points out, many of these people, the vast majority of which were individuals assigned female at birth presenting as men, were often presenting as the opposite gender for practical reasons. Take a bandit trying to evade the law, for instance. Many of these individuals chose to dress as the opposite gender to evade detection from the authorities, sometimes going to live entire lives as the different gender following their life as an outlaw. Or take, for example, a woman living in the patriarchal world of the Old West, unable to receive a livable wage or work, confined to labor in the home, and treated as mere property. In such In such harsh conditions, many women found it better to simply live their lives as a man. Indeed, Bogue himself told me via email that many of the individuals he researched were not trans. However, Bogue also argues that although many of these individuals presented as the opposite gender for pure practicality, many also may have been what we consider today as transgender. Somebody earlier mentioned Harry Allen. Harry Allen is a great example of somebody who we didn't have words like transgender or even really transsexual at the time. But by every metric, Harry Allen was trans, and we'll talk about him in a moment. Shockingly, Bogue also found that most individuals were only discovered to have been trans upon their death. The article The Forgotten History of the Wild West in Atlas Obscura lays out the particularly funny case of Sammy Williams. Williams, who was assigned female at birth, presented and publicly identified as male to his hometown in Montana. He worked as a lumberjack in the area, furthering his male status to those around him. So, when he died at the ripe age of 80, many in the area were shocked to discover he had been trans. Over to Sammy Williams from ExploreBigSky.com. About the only thing that can be said for certain about Sammy Williams is that he died in Manhattan, Montana on December 10th, 1908. Even how Williams died, his name and the rest of his life story are conflicting, murky, or uncertain. Now, this is something, before continuing, this is something that is incredibly important to remember here, because there is no telling. We're going to get to a story in a little bit of Old Nash, and for those of us who already know that story, don't post anything in the chat, because I think it's a fantastic story. But Old Nash, for those who don't know, was a trans woman who was only known by that name. Nobody knew her real name, where she came from before where she ended up. And this is really how we talked a little bit earlier about the kind of the westward promise of manifest destiny, westward expansion, but also in one of the earlier articles we mentioned how black people, gender nonconforming people, queer people sought out lives in the West because it was a place where nobody knew them. This is the kind of thing where you get the origins of these stories, the archetypes of the Western genre, of the mysterious stranger rolling into town. Are they good? Are they bad? Mysterious bounty hunters. Everything is mysterious in Westerns because there's no telling where somebody came from, where they're on their way to, what kind of trouble has followed them into town. Now, those make great dramatic setups, but in a microcosm, they were also true about so many people. And for that reason, so much of these people's past in history has been lost, both before they died and after they died. And that is a great example here of Sam Williams, and is another thing that's important to keep in mind as we continue talking about more of these people, just to imagine how many people were lost on trails, were lost in the woods, were gunned down in a saloon bar fight, were given a shallow grave out in the desert. Whatever Western nonsense befell them, and we'll never know if they were queer. They never had their chance to tell their story. So those are also important things to think about. What can be said beyond the date of Sammy's death is that the local undertaker, George R. Safely, was shocked to learn as he prepared the affable, longtime community member for burial that Sammy had the anatomy of a woman, despite being known to everyone as a man. Hardly knowing what to do, the members of the community, many who had been helped by Sammy's famous charity, chipped in for a headstone that still sits in Meadowview Cemetery south of Manhattan. Quote, "A female whose real name is unknown, but who has been for many years known as Sammy Williams. Died December 10th, 1908, age around 68 years. Though no one can say anything about Williams' reasons for arriving in Montana, although escape seems the most plausible, we know that when he came to Montana, he was accepted and loved, remembered for doing what any wild and woolly cook would do when arriving in Gallatin Valley. He was known for loving to dance with the ladies, enjoying a stiff drink without ever getting drunk, and for being a great cook. When Sammy died, there was an outpouring of grief from the men who worked the Hebe Ranch in Manhattan. Williams was known for caring for those who were sick, and some reported that at their most destitute moments, they would find $5 or $10 in their pocket, the quiet charity of Sammy. And he also voted. Charlotte Mills, the former clerk and recorder of Gallatin County, works as a part-time volunteer at the Gallatin Historical Museum and has helped research Dr. Rachel Phillips dig for clues about Williams' past. In most elections, Phillips said, women were not allowed to vote except for certain races like school boards. In Montana, women secured the right to vote in 1914, ahead of the franchise going nationwide in 1920. However, polling books showed that Sammy voted at least 3 times in elections in Gallatin County before 1900s. And he also had land, 320 acres, which he held at the time of his death. As county property records show, his estate was auctioned off, and in a handwritten note, it said the land belonged to Sammy H. Williams, a female. It's not that Sammy ran a charity, it's that Sammy was charitable. Yeah, it's not that Sammy had a specific charity. It's that if Sammy saw his coworkers struggling, if he knew that the men he worked with were down on their luck, he would give them $5 or $10 because that is just the kind of person he was. Already, there are so many things to talk about here. Among them being how trans people are treated after their death posthumously, which it shouldn't be surprised in a patriarchal society like we talked about earlier that if somebody is revealed to be a female, then suddenly the land becomes up for grabs. They put it on his tombstone, which is just like, it is disappointing, but it's something to remember that it was also not just surprising, not just incredibly unheard of and uncommon. Like this is the kind of case that when you were talking about people who live their entire lives out on the range, out in these small towns, helping to build them up. The idea of a trans person is something that, while it existed, obviously it existed, it was something that you couldn't guarantee anybody had ever even heard of, even in disparaging tones. It was something that was so unnormalized for so many people. But the most important thing, and the most important thing that I want people to walk away from with these lessons about these people is how they were regarded when they were still alive by their community and afterwards. The fact that Sammy was revealed to be AFAB did not stop his coworkers, the men he worked with, from remembering him fondly. Did not stop them from chipping in to buy a nice big tombstone when he passed away. It is important to remember the effect that actually knowing trans and queer people has on those around them. Actually understanding who they are, as opposed to just being told about them, which we see a lot today. People like Libs of TikTok, people like Matt Walsh do not actually know trans people. They do not actually know queer people. But even back in the Old West, people who knew trans people, queer people, even if they originally didn't know they were trans or queer, they worked alongside them. They were in communities with them. They were helped and helped them when they were sick and poor. They sat at tables and ate food with them, and they understood at the end of the day that even if they were different in some ways, ultimately they were still a part of that community, still a part of that family. In the late 1850s, census records in Eau Claire, Wisconsin show a Billy Williams who arrived to work as a camp cook for the area's thriving timber industry. Williams is recorded as a small, delicate-looking man with black hair, a feminine voice, and slightly hunched back. Billy frequently went out with the lumberjacks, where never hesitated to dance with the girls and spend his money. While he loved to drink and have a good time with his buddies, he was always careful never to become intoxicated, wrote Phillips in an article for Bozeman magazine in March 2017. Word quickly spread about Billy's talent as a cook, and nearby logging camps hired him without delay. As a cook for nearly 30 years, he acquired a lot of money, which he used to purchase buildings and lots in Eau Claire, a rarity that caught the attention of town leaders. Billy Cook was noted for speaking Norwegian, English, and German fluently, as well as picking up languages of the Native Americans in the area. Trouble came to Wisconsin when a family moved from not-so-distant Iowa to Eau Claire and noticed Billy's remarkable resemblance to the Weekend family. Word got back to Iowa, and one of the Weekend brothers was sent to Eau Claire to persuade Billy to return home. Billy made one last trip to Eau Claire back to Iowa, dressed as a tramp, to apparently get one final look at his parents and his former fiancée and his wife. From there, Billy went farther west, looking in North Dakota for several years before Sammy landed in Manhattan. It was there that Henry Hebe, a horse and cattle rancher, was in need of a ranch cook to replace his former employee who was getting older and wanted to return to his homeland of China. William's motives, his reasons, and even his backstory are vexingly elusive and simultaneously alluring, leading historians to think as much about what isn't known as what is. For 18 years, Sammy cooked and worked for different ranch outfits, Phillip records, including the Hebe Ranch, the Meadowbrook Ranch, the No. 1 Ranch, and the Manhattan Company. He chewed tobacco and slept in the bunkhouse with the hired hands. One source claims he was the first to get up in the morning and last to climb up to bed at night, changing his clothes in the dark while others slept. The mystery of the former identity of Williams was only learned after his death, when a local Gallatin County jeweler, C.J. Odell, believed that he had seen Sammy years before in Eau Claire. The Eau Claire chief of police was later able to fill in the details, recalling that Billy had disappeared shortly after his connection to the Weekend family was discovered. It's important to note he lived a different life than many others, but from all accounts, it was fulfilling, and he died surrounded by friends. Natives of Montana and the Wild West tend to paint Montana as a harsh, hypermasculine place where traditional gender roles have always been upheld. This picture erases the history and culture of indigenous peoples who lived here long before settlers, and even within the scope of a settler narrative, it excludes queer people. The most recent attack on trans rights is no different. It aims to exclude loved and important members of our community. But trans and queer people have always been and will always be critical members of our communities. Their stories have just been erased. These are some stories from the Wild West that might challenge the traditional story you've been told about this region. And here we hear the story of Harry Allen. Despite their presence, it would be inaccurate to say that the early West was a safe haven for queer people, a place where they were fully accepted and able to thrive freely. In actuality, people were arrested for not dressing according to their gender stereotype. However, it did offer more freedom than the strict societal rules in the East. During the early 1900s, Harry Allen was one of the trans people that came west to make a life for himself, and he ended up being one of the most notorious men in the West. He was known for gambling, stealing, fighting, bootlegging, and vagrancy. Vagrancy was a vague charge given to people who weren't conforming with society's rules. In Harry's case, this was for not dressing with his assigned gender. He was quoted in a 1908 issue of the Seattle Sunday Times saying, quote, "I did not like to be a girl, did not feel like a girl, and never did look like a girl, so it seemed impossible to make myself a girl. And, sick at heart over the thought that I would be an outcast of the feminine gender, I conceived the idea of making myself a man." Harry was in and out of jail for most of his life, but he also made quite a life for himself. He worked as a bartender, barber, and longshoreman. Allen never married, but he had a long-term partner, a sex worker looking for a different life with Allen. Allen's story is relatively well known because he was so notorious and newspapers latched onto his story wherever he traveled. There are other stories, however, of queer and trans people who lived quiet, peaceful lives that didn't involve running from the law constantly. Now, Harry Allen is maybe the perfect example to point to when people say trans people are a new thing. Like, why didn't we have trans people 50 years ago? Why didn't we have trans people 100 years ago? We did. Harry Allen is to the letter, to the T, so to speak, a trans person. The idea that you can look at this quote is everything you need to hear. "I did not like to be a girl, did not feel like a girl, and never did look like a girl, so it seemed impossible to make myself a girl, and, sick at heart over the thought that I would be an outcast of the feminine gender, I conceived the idea of making myself a man." You can't really, like, state it any more clearly than that, right? Like, that is somebody who feels wrong identifying in the way that they were assigned at birth, who felt right living as their truest self. Allen Hart, 1890 to 1962. Alan L. Hart was an Oregon physician, researcher, and writer, and one of the first female-to-male transgender persons to undergo a hysterectomy in the United States and live the remainder of his life as a man. Born Alberta Lucille Hart in Halls Summit, Kansas, the only child of Albert and Edna Hart. After Albert Hart died in 1892 following typhoid fever, Edna and Alberta moved to Oregon. Edna remarried in 1895 and eventually settled in Albany. Hart, goddamn, that's a long way away from Kansas. Hart was considered a masculine child and identified himself more as a boy than as a girl. In 1908, he enrolled in Albany College, where he gravitated towards the sciences and joined the debate team, which, by the way, schooling for women was still like not a super big thing at this time. Like that was still a very progressive and masculine thing to try and pursue at the turn of the century. Where he gravitated towards the sciences and joined the debate team. He transferred to Stanford in 1910 and helped establish the first women's debate club there. Exposed to the culture of San Francisco, he adopted tailored clothing and masculine habits. Returned to Albany and graduated in 1912. The following year, he enrolled to the University of Oregon Medical School, where he graduated in 1917. He was the first woman to receive the Sailor Medal for achieving the highest standing in all departments of the school. It was during his time in medical school that Hart realized that his attraction to women was considered abnormal by contemporary society. After his graduation, he sought psychiatric help from one of his professors, J. Allen Gilbert, whose treatment of Hart is documented in his 1920 case study, Homosexuality and Its Treatment. Hart discussed his sexual orientation with Gilbert, who at first tried analysis and hypnosis as a means of reverting his sexuality. It's so fucking funny. Like, it's funny to look at how medical approaches to sex and gender have advanced. Because you have people like this, right? Where at a time, there used to be a time in science, in medicine, where you would go to a doctor and be like, "Doctor, I like women," or "Doctor, I like men," and they would go, "Okay, let me hammer your brain, or let me put you in deep hypnosis." And it's like we've come so far, and all we really needed to do was try and understand more instead of trying to change the way people are. And it is this kind of like I think it's these outdated notions. Whenever you see like transphobes or somebody online say like, "You need to go to therapy," like I have a bunch of them in my on the video I just did talking to homophobes at Pride, where people are like, "You need therapy, you need this, that, and the other," just because I'm trans. And it's like, yeah, therapy said like, "Okay, you're trans, cool." Like there's this outdated notion of medicine I think they've internalized that is meant to be corrective rather than prescriptive. Following the procedure in the winter of 1917 to 18, he had his hair cut and acquired a male wardrobe. With that transformation, Alberta Lucille Hart became Alan L. Hart. Quote, "She made her exit as a female," Gilbert wrote, "and started as a male with a new hold on life and ambitions worthy of her high degree of intellectuality." In early 1918, Hart eloped with Inez Stark, a public school teacher from Independence. That July, he received his Oregon medical license and moved to Gardiner with plans to take over a practice. A former classmate recognized him, however, and told people that he had once been a woman, and so he abandoned his practice. The couple moved frequently, living in states across the West, as they often left towns whenever Hart's gender was called into question. By 1923, the marriage had collapsed. Inez later filed for divorce. Alan Hart returned to Oregon and enrolled in summer writing courses at the University of Oregon, where he met Edna Rudick. The couple married in New York in 1925. In 1928, Hart received a master's degree in radiology from the University of Pennsylvania and was named director of radiology at Tacoma General Hospital. Working for several years as a tuberculosis consultant in Washington and Idaho, moved with his wife to Hartford, Connecticut, where he received a master's degree in public... He's still receiving degrees in 1948. Good God. Like 20 years after... Over 20 years after the first degree, served as the director of hospitalization and rehabilitation at the Connecticut State Tuberculosis Commission and continued to dedicate his professional life to tuberculosis research. When synthetic male hormones became available after World War II, Hart used them to grow facial hair and obtain a deeper voice. Alan Hart died from heart failure on July 1st, 1962 in Hartford. When Edna died 20 years later, in March 21st, 1982, she left the majority of her estate to the Medical Research Foundation of Oregon in memory of her husband. Scholarship has disagreed on the identification of Hart as transgender, transsexual, or lesbian. Jonathan Katz was the first historian to identify Hart as the H in J. Allen Gilbert's 1920 case study. In his 1976 Gay American History, Katz described Hart as a lesbian. Others have identified him as transsexual or transgender, as he worked to keep his life prior to 1917 a secret and lived exclusively as a man following his transition. I want to talk about, because somebody brought her up earlier, I want to talk about Old Nash. Which is a fascinating story of a trans woman in the Old West. Like Old Nash is another great example of just the power of community, the power, the effect that just knowing somebody can have on whether you judge them or judge them not for being trans. On October 30th, 1878, one of the most famous Army laundresses passed away. During her life, she was beloved by nearly all men who met her and would quickly be favored by Libby Custer, who is the wife of General George Armstrong Custer. But with her death, a mystery would surface, one that captured the entire nation. Mrs. Nash had been born male. Little is known about the early life of Mrs. Nash. Her birth name has been lost to history, as well as much of her past. A little has survived, though. It was said she was from Mexico, where she was once married, had 2 children who passed away while still young. It appeared that at this time she had lived as a man, driving ox teams over the Santa Fe Trail to New Mexico. Eventually, Mrs. Nash would find her way to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, where she found a position as a laundress with the U.S. Army in 1866. Nash would gain a reputation as being not only an excellent laundress, but also a talented seamstress who tailored officers' uniforms. A noted baker whose pies were much sought after, and a dependable nurse and midwife who, quote, few births occurred on the post without her expert help. Making $17 a month as a laundress, which is like fucking bank back in the day, which was more than a private in the Army, as well as her work on the side, Nash would build up a sizable nest egg. It may not have been the first time she had worked her way to a fortune, though. She would later say that her first husband had earlier abandoned her, taking all of her money in the process. On April 3, 1871, the 7th Cavalry arrived in Elizabethtown, and on September 3, George Custer took command. They had been assigned to the southern city in order to deal with the Ku Klux Klan and illicit distilleries. For Nash, it would be a turning point. Arriving with Custer, Libby would first meet Nash. Immediately, Libby formed an admiration for the laundress. Being a friendly relationship, Libby would learn of the trials and tribulations of Nash, including her failed marriages. Along with striking a friendship with Libby, Nash would also meet her third husband, Sergeant James Nash. James was the personal servant to Libby's brother-in-law, Captain Tom Custer, and quickly fell for Nash. In 1872, the two were married. The two would be seen arguing a great deal, but they still seemed happy nonetheless. Attending military balls, where Nash was said to have constant partners, as well as other social functions, the marriage seemed to be a success. Nearly a year into their marriage, the 7th was ordered to Dakota Territory, and on June 10, 1873, Nash and her husband arrived at Fort Rice, where they would stay until they were transferred to Fort Abraham Lincoln on September 21st. In Dakota Territory, Nash would prosper, but not with James. As with her previous husbands, James would also desert Nash, taking with him her substantial savings. James leaving didn't go unnoticed, though. Libby would write that her brother-in-law was very put out by the desertion. While Nash may have grieved for the loss of at least a third husband as well as her savings, she would quickly rebound, marrying Sergeant John Noonan by the end of the same year. Noonan, as noted by Libby, was the handsomest soldier in the company and was often admired for his admirably fitting uniform Nash had made for him, which displayed to advantage his well-proportioned figure. So basically what George Custer's wife is saying here is she married the hottest soldier and then made him look good as hell with her tailoring. Nash, now often called Old Mrs. Nash, kept a bright and tidy home for Noonan, planting and maintaining a flower garden in front of their modest quarters. She made a home for the two of them, which became the center of the social circle in Suds Row, which was east of the Fort Lincoln parade grounds. The two would escape disaster in 1876 when Custer and his men set off for the Battle of Little Bighorn. Serving with the detached unit at the Yellowstone Depot, Noonan would return safely home to Nash after the battle, as opposed to literally everybody else. Crackhead Jimmy, have a good rest of your night. John Bainbridge, what is up with all these dudes robbing her? Because she made money. Like, she was good at her job. She made a shit ton of money being a seamstress and doing other odd jobs like midwifery. And like they would just take it. Like, she was making more than a private in the army. Like, she was doing good. And I mean, and again, like we were talking about earlier, this was a time where if you were able to just take money, if you had money and a horse, you can fucking go anywhere. You can do anything. As long as you got far enough away and nobody recognized you, you could kind of you could say, "Oh, I'm from this." You can make up your own backstory. You could be whoever you wanted. That's why it was the land of opportunity, so to speak. The couple would have 2 additional years of happily being married, but the end eventually came. In the fall of 1878, Noonan was sent out on patrol in pursuit of a party of rebellious indigenous people. While her husband was away, Nash suddenly fell ill from what is believed to be appendicitis. As Nash's condition worsened, she called for a priest and instructed those who cared for her that she wanted to be buried as she was. She did not want the normal preparations for her burial. Seeing that a great loss would soon come upon the fort, many would begin to mourn her imminent passing. As Gibbons writes, though, that mourning would, for some, turn to indignation. People demanded what right she had to make a glutton of herself on unripe corn when so many were dependent on her skillful Latin fingers for delicate laundering. Besides, the stork was threatening to alight at any moment upon several chimneys. It wasn't fair, they all contended. So basically, what that is saying there is that, God damn it, why'd you have to go and make yourself sick? Because so many people here depend on you. Like, we have multiple babies coming and we need you. Like, that is I don't know if that's indignation so much as that seems like a very tongue-in-cheek way to express regret. Like, that seems less sincere than it does half-hearted. Wanting to show Nash the proper respect that she deserved by cleaning her up, her closest friends removed her clothing and discovered that Nash wasn't really a man, that's not the right way to phrase it, discovered that Nash had been born a man. Berkman noted, "We was flabbergasted." Libby would relate it in much kinder words. Quote, "The mystery which the old creature had guarded for so many years, through a life always public and conspicuous, was revealed. Old Nash, years before, becoming weary of the laborious life of a man, had assumed the disguise of a woman and hoped to carry the secret to her grave." End quote. The news quickly spread throughout the country as a dispatch from Bismarck, Dakota Territory informed the nation, quote, "A singular development transpired at Fort Lincoln today. Miss Sergeant Noonan, who died last night, turns out to be a man. There is no explanation of the unnatural union except that the supposed Mexican woman was worth $10,000 and was able to buy her husband's silence. She has been with the 7th Cavalry 9 years." End quote. Noonan wouldn't inherit the fortune from his wife, but instead Nash had given it all to Bismarck Catholic Church. Instead, upon returning to the sad news that his wife has passed away, Noonan was greeted by unrelenting harassment and ridicule from his fellow soldiers. Having just lost the person he loved, who he called his wife, and no longer being able to stand the company of his fellow soldiers, Noonan quickly withdrew. Avoiding others, he busied himself by cleaning the stables south of Fort Lincoln. On November 28th, a reporter from the Bismarck Tribune was finally able to locate Noonan. He was adamant that, quote, he didn't know his wife was a man. In face, he said that they had been trying very hard to have a baby. Another mystery was at hand, though, according to Noonan. Quote, "There's some terrible mystery about this thing that I can't understand. She had acted as a midwife and doctress here at the post. She was trusted and respected by a large number of people, and I can only think that she must have done something terribly wrong which demanded a disguise of her sex by the diagnosing physicians." End quote. Years later, it was clear that Noonan's fellow troopers were far from having been relieved by his suicide, but Berkman said they were terribly ashamed. Quote, "Noonan's troubles meant just as much to him as though he'd been a major. Hundreds of graves scattered over Dakota and Montana of men that's never been missed, never been writ up, but they was good soldiers just the same. And without 'em, there wouldn't have been no country, maybe." Noonan would be buried with his fellow soldiers, first at Fort Lincoln and later reinterred at the Custer Battlefield National Cemetery, where a bit of the honors stripped away from his fellow soldiers was returned. Nash would also be buried at Fort Lincoln, but upon the fort's closing, would not be accompanying her husband. Instead, As with the other unclaimed civilian bodies, she was moved to St. Mary's Cemetery to be laid in an unmarked grave in Section D between row 1 and 11. And much like with Harry Allen, much like with the other people we've looked at, there are so many people who don't understand. And the first reaction to that non-understanding is prejudice and bigotry. But again, the people who knew Old Nash, Libby Custer, who was her friend, upon hearing the news, that wasn't featured in this article, but I'm quoting it for another thing I'm working on. Upon hearing the news that Old Nash had been born a man, had been AMAB, assigned male at birth, Libby Custer's just said, "Poor dear, I hope she's comfortable." 1800s. A friend respecting a trans woman's pronouns. I don't want to ever hear somebody saying like, "Oh, well, it's hard for me to get pronouns right." Like, if the wife of a Civil War general got pronouns right, I feel like somebody in 2024 can too. You know? One of the most important things that I want people to walk away from, hearing about all of these lives, hearing about the trans people, the queer people, the gay cowboys, is the understanding that people like us, people like me, people like many of you have always been an integral part of American society, of every society. And despite the best efforts to wash away our contributions, the fact that we have been good people, that we have been members of our community, that we have cared for others, has superseded any prejudice, any hate, any bigotry, and fear of outsiders. The reason why we know many of these stories is because of how loved and respected they were in their communities. And this is a famous poem about gay cowboys. And I feel like it would be a fitting way to close things out, called The Lost Pardner. I ride alone and hate the boys I meet. Today, some way, their laughin' hurts me so. I hate the mockingbirds on the mesquite, and yet I liked 'em just a week ago. I hate the steady sun that glares and glares. The bird songs make me sore. I seem the only thing on earth that cares, 'cause Al ain't here no more. 'Twas just a stumbling hoss, a tangled spur, and when I raised him up so limp and weak, one look before his eyes began to blur, and then the blood that wouldn't let him speak. And him so strong and yet so quick he died, and after year on year, when we had always trailed it side by side, he went and left me here. We loved each other in the way that men do, and never spoke about it, Al and me. But we both knowed, and knowing it so true, was more than any woman's kiss could be. We knowed, and if the way was smooth or rough, the weather shine or pour, while I had him, the rest seemed good enough, but he ain't here no more. What is there out beyond the last divide? Seems like that country must be cold and dim. He'd miss the sunny range he used to ride, and he'd miss me the same as I do him. It's no use thinking all I'd think or say could never make it clear. Out that dim trail that only leads one way, he's gone and left me here. The range is empty and the trails are blind, and I don't seem but half myself today. I wait to hear him riding up behind and feel his knee rub mine the good old way. He's dead, and what that means no man can tell. Some call it gone before. Where, I don't know, but God I know so well that he ain't here no more.